the cilia. The cilia are short and mini. If you look at the cell on the left, it looks like a hairbrush. It's just got all these little extensions off the outside of it. Those are the cilia. They can help a cell move. When you looked at your protists in lab last week, you saw like the parameciums, and they had the little ciliates, they had little hairs on the outside of them, and they'll kind of beat those like oars to move around in a liquid. But you also see these as parts of multicelled organisms. Your lungs actually have a lot of cilia on the cells in your lungs because you're breathing in all kinds of stuff. You don't want that just to sit on top of the cells in your lungs, and they couldn't get as much oxygen into them. And they need that oxygen so it can go throughout the body, so it can go to the mitochondria and help to make ATP. So the cilia kind of beat and keep things moving around so nothing settles on top of a cell. These can be damaged. They can, different chemical exposures and smoke exposures can damage the cilia. And something you actually see from a physiology standpoint, the people who tend to smoke have what's called a smoker's cough. That's actually because, like in the morning when they get up and they haven't had that chemical added into their lungs yet, their cilia have actually kind of woken up a little bit, and they'll start beating. And when they start beating, they start moving a lot of material around, and so that individual needs to clear out their lungs because their cilia are working. And then usually they get chemically stunned again, and then they don't work as well. And then the next time they're kind of not stunned as much. They start working, and then they start kicking up a lot of material that has to be coughed out. You also see the cilia not only in your lungs, well, that's a really good example. You also see them in your ear. You know, how you hear is actually based on cilia as well. So your ear cells up in your cochlea have cilia on them. And if I'm talking really softly, then those cilia are barely being touched, just nudged a little. But if I talk really loudly, then I'm pushing those cilia over, and you hear that louder sound because those cilia, the sound waves that are coming out of my mouth, are pushing the cilia over further. So you have a lot of cilia there as well in those cells. The other cell extension is the flagella. It's also made of microtubules, extends outside of the cell, and usually these are very, very long and they're few. In animals, we only have one example. You know, we have lots of examples of ciliated cells in animals, but as far as flagella go, we only have one example in animals, and that's the sperm cell. So males have a sperm cell, and it has that long tail on it. It kind of whips that tail back and forth to be able to swim. Now, one thing to think about that's kind of interesting talking about that human cell that has that long flagella on it is if that cell is if that tail is going to whip back and forth, that must require a lot of energy. Well, that's a single cell. It's one cell that makes up that sperm there on the right that you're looking at. And it's got all the organelles. It's got a nucleus. That's the big head part of it. It's got rough ER and smooth ER. It needs fats. It also needs a lot of proteins involved in actually getting into that egg. And it's got mitochondria. Where do you think all the mitochondria are? If that tail is having to whip to get movement, it must require a lot of energy. And if it requires a lot of energy, then most of the mitochondria are actually going to be focused up there by the tail to provide the energy directly there for it to move. This sets up a really, really interesting point, a point called mitochondria Eve. You know, if we're talking about your primary source of DNA, up in your nucleus, you got 50% from mom, 50% from dad. Because if we're looking at that picture on the right, half of the information came from that big egg cell there, and half of the information came from the nucleus and that sperm cell there. But where else do we find DNA in a cell? Kind of, you know, the odd example of other DNA in the cell. Well, we find it in the mitochondria. But all the mitochondria for the males are located back near the tail. And an interesting thing that happens during fertilization in animals, as soon as that head of the sperm penetrates into the egg goes on lockdown because it doesn't want any other sperm getting in there and causing any problems. So it goes on lockdown and basically lops the tail off. You have 50% of the DNA that makes your hair the color it is, the skin the color it is, the eyes the color that they are, 50% from mom, 50% from dad. But if we were to take the mitochondria from your cells and look at the mitochondrial DNA, about 99% of that is from your mom. Most of your mitochondrial DNA is from mom, because it's not that dad didn't have it, dad has it. It's just for his delivery mechanism of that flagella having to, propel that cell along, it concentrates the mitochondria up near that, and that doesn't get into the new fertilized egg. So that's kind of interesting. They can do a lot of studies with that, kind of tracking where people have come from, because it's a pure line of DNA. It's not, it's not half and half. It's not any kind of recombinations going on. It's kind of an interesting little tool. So the last thing that we had to talk about for this chapter, before we move on and talk about the energy stuff, is a couple of more structures that are outside of the plasma membrane. So we have some microtubules that can extend outside the plasma membrane, but then we have some kind of encapsulating structures that can go to the exterior of the plasma membrane, namely the cell wall. The cell wall is really thick, especially in comparison to that plasma membrane. Our plasma membrane might be like 6 nanometers, whereas our cell wall can measure up in the micrometer range. So it's really thick. It's a lot bigger than the plasma membrane. Doesn't mean the plasma membrane's not there. It's just underneath that really thick cell wall. And that cell wall is typically made out of sugars, different kinds of sugars for different types of organisms, because your cell wall is really not exclusive to plants. I mean, we see it in plants for sure, but we also see it in bacteria. We see it in some fungi. Some of the protists you looked at last time had cell walls, so it's not, it's not a members-only kind of exclusion. We see it in lots of different cell types. So we have that cell wall, and what does it do? Why is it there? Well, it gives a lot of strength to that organism, especially if it has to deal with fluctuating kinds of conditions. Also, a lot of times these organisms that have cell walls have a lot higher percentage of water. Like a plant can be 90% water. And if you look back at that central vacuole, that was a lot of water. And so really, you don't want to overdo it then. You've already got a lot of water in there. You can't afford to absorb much more. And so the cell wall helps to limit water absorption and water loss. So it's really good for that. It's also a protective mechanism. I mean, a plant's not going to have an immune system like we do. It's not going to have immune cells that go out and hunt things down. But it's still going to be under attack from bacteria, from fungi, from viruses, and that cell wall helps to protect. It keeps things from being able to get into the cell. What about some cons? What are some negatives? It makes an organism really rigid and inflexible, so it can't move as easily. And that's why a plant generally is not going to get up and run after you. Their cell structure just kind of doesn't lend that property to it, because they are such an inflexible cell type. Now, one last thing to talk about with our kind of extracellular things are junctions. Just because we have a cell wall doesn't mean that a plant cell doesn't need to talk to another plant cell, and to do that quickly. There might be some stimulus, might be something happening that those cells need to respond to. And so that cell wall is kind of a hamper to communication. But there are junctions that exist, kind of little tubes that link the cells that allow them to directly communicate to themselves. So there are some different types of junctions, gap junctions, that allow cells to talk to each other. You also have a lot of tight junctions. If you think about our cells, if you grab your skin and pull on it, well, it doesn't shatter and pull apart. Those cells stick together. And the reason they stick together is they've got little bits of connective proteins between them that make tight junctions, so that they form that nice smooth layer that is hopefully, for the most part, impenetrable by bacteria and viruses and things of that nature. So those junctions help that. If I pour a pitcher of water on my arm, it's just going to pour off for the most part, because my skin is pretty impermeable to those kinds of things, because of the junctions in between the cells, and those are types of tight junctions. And that is that for this chapter, and we will be starting on energy on Thursday.